Welcome in, everyone. I'm your host, Gabe Yoakum. Welcome to Tradecraft. On the podcast, I talk to people who are incredibly good at what they do. Together, we take a deep dive into the distilled passion that makes successful people successful. Equal parts informative, interesting, and inspiring. We want you to walk away having learned something and feeling duly entertained. To that end, Dirk Manning is the writer and creator of many comic series, such as Tales of Mr. Ree, Nightmare World, Twisted Haunted High-Ons, Hope, Butts and Seats, the Tony Schiavone Story. That's coming soon. Very excited about that one. Love Stories to Die For, and The Adventures of Cthulhu Jr. and Dastardly Dirk. Now predominantly publishing with SourcePoint Press, Dirk was an early adopter of crowdfunding to launch his comics and graphic novels. And with Dirk's work having raised over $250,000 and counting in pre-sales on Kickstarter alone, I think he's probably someone to talk to about this sort of thing. Dirk is also the author of the inspirational how-to column turned book series, Right or Wrong, and that's WRITE for the uninitiated, a writer's guide to creating comics, and has created several short stories to go with the RPG series, Clockwork Dominion, for Reliquary Game Studios. When not at his desk writing, touring on the comic convention circuit, of course, when we're not in the midst of a pandemic, or sampling his way across the best ice cream shops in the world, pandemic notwithstanding, as ice cream waits for no man. Dirk is also a personal friend of mine and has been roughly since the day I met him 6 years ago, a strategy that I'm sure we will touch on during our discussion. Dirk Manning, welcome to the Tradecraft.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I am super excited to be here. I'm curious what we're going to talk about. It's like, maybe we talk about how I can write a good bio, or so.
Look, we're not going to let people in on the secrets of how we do things here that early in the game.
That's fair. That's fair.
Let's keep things close to the vest.
That's we? Right. We will not break kayfabe this early.
I think if we're going to talk about Dirk Manning, we got to start at the beginning, right?
Okay.
When did you know you wanted to start to write? You're a writer.
Yes.
When did you know?
You know, I'm trying to say this in the least pretentious way possible. And I find myself immediately struggling, so I'm just going to be direct and be blunt. We're friends.
This is important, yeah.
Yeah. I was born a writer, you know. I just think there's that innate thing in me. I've been a voracious reader since I was little. I'm very fortunate. My parents read to me every night, and I read often. But I knew I wanted to do this professionally, even if I didn't have that word for it, when I was about 12. And I actually can vividly, I could tell you exactly where I was. My parents were driving, obviously, and the exact spot when I realized that, you know, I want to write as a career. I want to write as a job. I want to write professionally. I want my stuff to be seen. I want my stuff to be out there. And I want to contribute to the tapestry of literature. I will say that's before I started reading comics. I didn't start reading comics till a couple of years later, and really fell in love with this medium. But yeah, I was very. I guess I would think I was very young, you know, like 12 years old, and like, I'm going to be a writer, and that's going to be the thing that I'm going to do in the world, you know, like little Chef Boyardee in that old commercial, you know. Someday I will create a food that is, inexpensive and it tastes good and is good for, or whatever the hell what he said in there. But yeah, I was about 12.
So you talked about comics. Obviously, you write comics predominantly. So
yes,
you didn't grow up reading them. I know that about you. So
right.
Why comics, and what was your first? What was the tipping point, Dirk Manning?
Comics is such a fascinating medium, and again, obviously, I think due to a litany of factors, most people associate comics with superheroes, and anybody that's a student of the game can tell you why that is, and how comics, originally explored many other genres than superhero, and things came up with the comics code and things like that. But I love the medium, and there's a specific way that you can tell a story in comics that you can't do any other way. Harvey Pekar, the late great Harvey Pekar, once said, "Comics are words and pictures, and you can do anything with words and pictures." A lot of people might know Harvey Pekar. There's a movie made about him based on one of his works, American Splendor. But that words and pictures thing is so fascinating to me. And I discovered, I knew of comics. I read comics, like individual comics here and there. When I was younger, my grandmother had some at her house, just like, "Oh, here's something for you to do when you're bored. You like to read this, or what have you." But I first really discovered them going into, of all places, and I talk about this in Right or Wrong Volume 1, so I'll be quick for those that may be listening to this that have read the book and know this. I went to a skateboard shop right around Christmas time, and I had my Steve Caballero skateboard, and was getting some stuff done on it. I still have that board, as a matter of fact. And he had just started. He had these at least two, maybe more, massive long form magazine racks, the kind where like they stack up, bit by bit by bit, filled with comics. And what interested me about that was the fact that I thought, oh my gosh, if I find a comic series that I like, I'll have more to read every month forever. That's what drew me in. The fact that there was constantly, like, if I could find like some mythos, some character or something I liked, I could read about that character for a long time. The first comic I bought, I'm actually, if you can hear that? I am holding the first comic I ever bought in my hand right now. It was The Incredible Hulk, number 364 by Peter David was the writer. And what drew me to it was two things. One, when I was young, I would watch the Incredible Hulk TV series with, and the other thing was I just thought it was a cool marketing gimmick. This was a 4-part storyline called Countdown. And it had like a hourglass in the background with skulls on it and stuff. But then it was part 4 of 1. And I just thought that's kind of witty. That's kind of cool. Hulk's gray on here. I don't know why Hulk's gray. He was green. He's green in the TV show, but that's kind of a cool thing. Whatever. The interesting, thing. And I bought it and I read it. Peter David is a hell of a comic book writer. And I was in. I was like, this is really interesting. I want to read more. Shortly thereafter, I realized I wanted to start a series from the beginning. So that was I want to find a cool number 1 that I can start at the beginning. And Ghost Rider, the Ghost Rider relaunch by with Howard Mackey and Javier and Tex came out. And me being a horror guy by nature, I grew up watching The Twilight Zone and stuff like that with my great grandma, and I've always been a horror person and a heavy metal person. This flaming skeleton on from hell on a motorcycle. I'm like, yeah, this is it. Cool. I could dig this. But in the meantime, or about that time, I also kind of stumbled into a trifecta of comics that I think really defined me. And for a guy that, again, sporadically read a couple comics here and there and things like that, in very short order, I had these 3 graphic novels foisted upon me from different sources. Watchmen by, obviously, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. And The Crow by James O'Barr. So, for all intents and purposes, again, I read this issue of the Hulk, and around, I think, shortly thereafter, someone could go through and look it up, but the Ghost Rider number 1, the relaunch. What I came to find out eventually was a relaunch of that book. But the first 3 long-form things I read were Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, and The Crow. And I took so much out of each of those books in regard to, again, the medium. and the format and the storytelling and the way to tell the story. And like with Jim O'Barr and The Crow, him bleeding on the page, literally bleeding on the page when he did that book. And the rhythm of the storytelling of Watchmen. A lot of people talk about Watchmen being one of the greatest comic books of all time. And it is, but it's not the story. The story's pedestrian. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Let me stop you. You talk about reading a story like this and the rhythm of the story.
Yeah.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Watchmen is all in 9-panel grids. Mm-hmm. And again, and eventually, again, you dig deep into this stuff. You read like Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud talks about this masterfully. How, or even let's tie that, giving Scott McCloud credits due, back to the Harvey Pekar, statement. Comics are words and pictures. You're telling a story in still images juxtaposed with text. The images don't move. You cannot control the pace with which someone does it. You can pick up a comic and go and flip right through it. Now, you can't do that with a movie. I mean, you could fast forward it or something, I guess, or whatever. But in a comic book, you cannot control the pace at which the reader will digest and absorb the information. So as a writer or as an artist or as a comic book creator, you have to learn how to hold them on the panels, for example, as best you can, but knowing you can't control them, or recognize that, doing a repeat panel motif to demonstrate the illusion of the passage of time and of holding that moment in time. And Scott McCloud talks about how the action in the comic book panels happens between the panels in what they call the gutter, that little space between the panels. And Watchmen, the reason Watchmen's one of the greatest comic books ever created is just as much Dave Gibbons as it is Alan Moore. And that attention to the rhythm, that pacing of the story, and that 9-panel grid. And sometimes you'll have a full page image, but it still exists in the confines of that grid. And then you go back to that, 9 panels a page, 9 panels a page, 9 panel, and you create a rhythm. Because people that don't read comics normally, if you give them a comic book that's not written in a structured fashion, oftentimes they don't know, what panel do I read next? What's going on? What do I do? And even a poorly put together comic page, even experienced readers will do this sometimes. Like, I'm not sure what panel I'm supposed to read next.
Absolutely.
So that's that rhythm to it. And the way to tell that story in words and pictures fascinated me. I love the medium. People would come to me all the time like, why don't you just write regular books? And I'm like, well, I've written short stories and I don't mean this in a cruel fashion, but I mean, writing a novel is a whole different activity. But to me, it's kind of, I don't want to say boring, but it's not where my heart is. My heart is in this medium. My heart is in telling stories in this fashion, with the emotional impact of The Crow, with the technical savvy of Watchmen, with the grit and the I don't say twisted storytelling, but I guess more the grit and the changed expectations of something like Dark Knight Returns. If you grew up watching the Batman, Adam West, Burt Ward from the '60s, then you read the Dark Knight Returns, it's like, oh, you can do this. But then applying that to, again, original characters, and just bringing all that together and engaging people, hooking them in, and it's just such a powerful medium. There's ways you can tell stories in this medium that you can't do in any other way.
And we'll get to where you decided to start writing comics, but I want to take this in order a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about your first comics. We talked about how you fell in love with the medium.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote your first comic book in 2007-ish? Is that right?
No, I was first published in 2007. I actually started writing in 2001, 2002.
Great. So we all grow up, right?